You know, the Quran, it's one of the most influential books in all of history. It shaped entire civilizations and, to this day, guides over 1 billion people. But there's a question that always seems to pop up. Was it really just written by one man, the Prophet Muhammad? Well, today, we're going to investigate that very claim and look at the traditional arguments against it.
So let's just get right to it. The big question. Was the Quran, with all of its incredible depth, its unique language, its complex laws, was that all just the product of one man's imagination? That's the core question we're going to tackle in this explainer. All right, so let's dive in. We're going to approach this almost like detectives, looking at the evidence piece by piece, from historical, literary, and even logical angles, to see what kind of picture emerges.
Okay, our first piece of evidence, it's all about the Prophet Muhammad himself. See, he was widely known in his community as Nabi, and what that means is the unlettered prophet. He couldn't read or write.
And the Quran itself actually calls this out directly. This verse basically says, look, if the prophet had been a scholar, if he could read and write, then people would have every reason to be skeptical. They'd say, oh, he's just copying from old books, but he wasn't. So this is where it gets really interesting, right? Think about it. How could someone who everyone knew couldn't read or write, with no formal schooling, possibly produce a work of this magnitude? Not just its theological depth, but to do it consistently over 23 years without tripping over himself. That's a huge challenge to the idea that he was the author. Now, for our second proof, we've got to transport ourselves back in time to 7th century Arabia. This was a place where language was everything. They were obsessed with poetry and eloquence. It was their highest art form. And right into the heart of this culture, the Quran throws down this incredible challenge. It doesn't just say, I'm special. It says, oh, you're in doubt? You think a human wrote this? Fine. Go ahead and produce just one chapter like it. And when we say a chapter, what are we really talking about? The shortest chapter in the entire book is just 3 verses long. So the challenge wasn't some impossible task to write a whole new epic. It was to match the style, the power, and the meaning of just 3 short lines. And here's the kicker. For over 1,400 years, that challenge has been on the table, and nobody's been able to meet it. Not the greatest poets of that time, who were the most qualified to try, and not anyone since. It remains completely unmatched. Okay, our third piece of evidence is a bit different. It's psychological. Think about it. When someone writes a book, especially one they claim is divine, how do they usually portray themselves? As perfect, right? Flawless? Well, the Quran does the exact opposite. Take this verse, for example. It's recording a divine correction, right there for everyone to see, forever. The prophet was trying to talk to some important tribal leaders, and a blind man interrupted him, seeking guidance. The prophet frowned, and boom, this verse comes down, correcting his reaction on the spot. And that's not the only time, not by a long shot. Here's another one, questioning a personal decision the prophet made just to please his family. These are the kinds of things you'd write about yourself if you were trying to build up your own image as a perfect, infallible leader. So this leads to a really powerful question, doesn't it? If you're the author, if you're trying to get people to follow you, why on earth would you permanently record your own mistakes? It just doesn't make sense from a psychological standpoint. It sounds a lot more like a messenger who has to deliver the message exactly as it's given, no matter what. All right, let's move on to our final proofs. These are all about the mechanics, how the Quran was actually delivered, and what it says about its own origins. This brings us to our fourth proof, the chain of transmission. The process wasn't the prophet sitting alone writing a book. The verses would be revealed to him, and he would immediately recite them out loud to his companions. And they had scribes whose whole job was to write it down right then and there. It was a public, verifiable process. And that leads to our fifth proof, which is the Quran's own explicit claim. Over and over, it says, this message is from God, delivered by the angel Gabriel to the prophet. He was the recipient, the conveyor, not the author. And just as one last point to think about, the source material often points to verses that describe the natural world, things like detailed stages of how an embryo develops, or the idea that the universe is expanding, or that mountains act like pegs stabilizing the earth. The argument made is that these ideas seem to echo scientific discoveries that would only be made centuries later, things that would have been completely unknown in 7th century Arabia. So let's just step back for a second and look at the whole picture. When you put all of these pieces together, you get a cumulative case. You have an illiterate prophet, a literary challenge that has never been met, a book that openly corrects its own messenger, a clear historical record of dictation, not authorship, and a consistent claim of its divine source. Each piece is designed to strengthen the others.
And that brings us right back to the beginning, to the main question, which we'll leave with you. Considering all this evidence, what's the most logical conclusion you can draw about who wrote the Quran? It's a question that's as profound today as it was over 1,400 years ago.